Serious Grower Podcast. I am Anna. I am an entomologist. I am a scientist. I'm using this podcast to talk to all kinds of growers and eaters who are serious about their farms, their gardens, and their local food systems. And I'm asking, how can science help? Today's co-host is Casey. She's an experienced market farmer, having grown in Northern California and now in the Bitterroot Valley out in western Montana. Her and her husband, Jesse, are transitioning into non-commercial farming. They are homesteaders now. You'll be hearing plenty from her because her experience brings so many unique perspectives and because she's my best friend. And avid listeners will know she's also a fruit crop enthusiast. And Casey has been building out her small fruit garden and looking to fill in her late season maturing crops. We discussed kiwiberry in an early episode, so look for that conversation with Will Hastings. I also thought figs might be of interest to her, and I know that some work has been done to grow these plants where they do not belong in northern climates because figs are a Mediterranean crop. Figs are actually one of the first plants ever cultivated by humans, predating wheat and legumes by nearly 1,000 years. So we are thinking like Fertile Crescent times. This also means they are pretty heat and drought tolerant and can do very well in container gardening, so something to keep in mind. Botanically speaking, figs are technically a synconium, a fleshy vessel containing hundreds of tiny flowers blooming inward, right? So most of the time, if you think about fruits, we're thinking about a regular flower being pollinated and producing a fruit around it. This is kind of an inside-out fruit. Many wild fig varieties rely on a symbiotic relationship with tiny fig wasps. The wasp enters the fig to lay eggs, pollinating it into the process, which leads to the fleshy fruit on the outside that forms around these flowers. But, don't worry, your figs aren't full of wasp eggs. Most of the cultivated varieties that you'll see grown outside of the Mediterranean, the fruit that you'll see in the grocery store, are parthenocarpic. So they don't need to be pollinated and don't need those fig wasps crawling up in there. Another important point about figs is they do not ripen after being picked the way that apple might. You must wait until they are soft to the touch and drooping on the stem before picking them. So you have that sweet, sweet, delicious fruit. So even with season extension, we can sometimes be cutting it kind of close in terms of the season being long enough up here in New Hampshire and maybe in Montana. However, immature figs also have a place in the culinary world as they contain higher levels of ficin. This is an enzyme that breaks down protein. It can make it a great natural meat tenderizer. I read that this enzyme has also been an important component in cheese making at some point in ancient history. So leaves and the stems and the immature fruits, when you pick them, all this white stuff comes out. It's very latex heavy. It's also very rich in this ficin tenderizer, which can be used to make cheese. Very cool. All right. Well, we're not interested in making cheese. We're interested in growing delicious sweet fruits. So we need to have a long season. And I will get back to my conversation with Casey.
Oh, and I meant to tell you, for the very first time ever in my life, yesterday, I was at the grocery store, produce aisle, kiwi berries right there in a clamshell container. It was like a little bit bigger than a raspberry sort of clamshell, like a little bit wider. You know how the raspberry ones are like square? Maybe there's like 20 kiwi berries in that clamshell because they're not berry. They're like a big berry, if you call it a berry. So maybe about 20 kiwi berries in this clamshell, $6.99. Like, yeah, we actually could strike it rich on kiwi berries.
Oh, man.
I'm like, who's going to buy that? Really? But some people might be so curious. They're like, what is that?
For the novelty,
I have
I
to.
guess.
Yeah, just a novelty thing. But the first time I had ever seen them in a grocery store, and it was yesterday.
I do have some information to share with you. If you remember, we were talking about figs.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know how excited you are about figs.
I'm very excited about figs.
So I found a research report that I will share with you for your references. But Becky Seidman is a horticultural crop production specialist. She actually has some background in crop breeding as well. But at the University of New Hampshire, she does a lot of really cool stuff with crop production in northern climates. So even though all the resources I have may not be appropriate for you in Montana, at least we know that they're doing well in northern climates. So let me see if I can share this with you. So she talks about some other research that was done. I found a couple like farmer grants, like Sarah does farmer grants, like people trying to grow these in tunnels. I believe that all these varieties are the parthenocarpic varieties, so they do not need to be pollinated. I think some
Aha.
of the wild pollinated varieties, they have a very unique relationship with their pollinators. It's like a wasp. Have you heard this?
Oh, no, I didn't know this.
I think like in the wild, figs are pollinated by fig wasps, and they actually, I think, often die inside the fig.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
if you end up reading anything about figs and somebody's saying, "Oh, you can't grow figs because we don't have fig wasps here," that's not true. They actually have varieties that are parthenogenetic, like they reproduce without being pollinated.
Oh, okay. So that's what I would need for here
Yeah,
because we'd have fig wasps.
right. And so these varieties, not only are they those varieties, but like they do well in northern climates, we think. She was looking at a couple different ways of doing this, like either putting them in a high tunnel to protect them or growing them outdoors and just doing a couple different things to protect their roots. In the long, like the take home message here is that no matter what you do, you're gonna have lower yields across the board to the point where, like, I don't think anybody grows these commercially,
Hmm.
but you can definitely get fruit. These are the outdoor treatments that she had. So you'll see like there's row cover, there's plastic tunnels, and then there's these cages that are full of leaves.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, it's saying if you cut back these figs every year, protect the roots from being killed by winter injury, and they'll grow up and they'll fruit by the end of the year. As long as the season's long enough, you'll get some fruit. That might not be enough fruit to make it worth your while for a commercial producer in northern climates, but if your goal is just to have some figs, then that would be worthwhile. This treatment with the leaves was the most effective at protecting the roots as far as keeping the ground from freezing.
Yeah, I could see that. So I see there's like chicken wire over the leaves, kind of. I wonder if that's just to hold them in,
I
hold the
think so.
leaves in place.
To keep them from blowing away.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's why you cut them back is just so that they fit in these like treatment areas. Like so they fit.
I think so. I think so. Of course,
Huh.
they still had problems with voles. Like, that's gonna be a problem if you
Oh.
have voles.
Yeah,
So,
we've had vole problems, but okay, so here they are in the high tunnel. Oh, just under some remay.
yep. And then this is in October.
Wow,
So
they really grew a lot, reaching like the crossbar by the end
yep.
of the season. And so they cut them back only to about like a foot or two tall.
Yeah, in the tunnels.
Huh.
That's what they look like under the outdoor ones too.
Well, that's interesting. I don't think anybody does a commercial around here, but I've seen pictures and things of people's garden. There's a few people that really tout their underground, dug into earth greenhouses. And figs are really popular in a garden like that. There's two
I can
different ones
see
that I can think of right now, and the figs seem to have no problem. There was a guy talking about he tried to do avocados in one of these like underground greenhouses, and they did end up, having a real problem handling frost and cold injury, but the figs were just loving it in there in these underground sort of dug into the earth greenhouses. But, that's just like such a labor intensive process to build a greenhouse like that. It wouldn't probably be worth it commercially to do like underground greenhouse fig cultivation. But at the same time, there's another farm up the road from here that does all sorts of like exotic fruits in these heated greenhouses. They're above ground, but just lots and lots of money, I imagine they spend to heat these greenhouses to keep from ever going below freezing in the winter. Bananas, little avocados in there.
What I wonder though, Casey, is like, especially where you are, is there any opportunity to build greenhouses associated with like geothermal hot springs?
There's coming up tomorrow a auction on this hot spring that's down the road from here. It's called Medicine Hot Springs, and it's been on the market like 4 years or so now, listed for like $8 million. The last people tried to fix it up, and it used to be like a resort sort of place and cabins, and people can come stay there. But I don't know for sure, but I've heard that it was because they had like septic issues. They couldn't actually rent the cabins and have the hot spring in the close vicinity to the river. I'm not exactly sure the deal, but they could never make a go of it commercially. But if we had $8 million and bought the place, we could have that geothermal to then heat greenhouses. So when we went to Iceland a couple of years ago, that was the thing there. They produced so much of their own food in Iceland. It's like this really just horrible climate for crop production, but it was all greenhouses, all geothermally heated. And a lot of the power in the whole country is geothermal. One of their big industries there is aluminum production because of the heat of the geothermal energy. And it takes a lot of heat to make aluminum. It's pretty small, like island nation, but you would see just big diameter pipes going all around, these metal pipes. And that was the water. That was hot water. Every hotel we ever stayed at, there was some sort of like hot water drying rack or like towel warmers, and everything was hot water powered. They're pretty self-sufficient there. They had
Cool.
lots of sheep, Icelandic sheep that were just like so furry, all these tiny, super furry horses. Then they had greenhouses all over. Amazing. It was like lettuces, leafy greens coming out of these greenhouses. I mean, tomatoes, anything you ever wanted.
So what do you think the people down the street from you that have the bananas in Montana, like, are they heating that with, do you know?
I'm not sure what they're heating it with. I assumed it was natural gas. So they're interesting. If you want to look it up, it's called ABC Acres. They've done all sorts of interesting things. And I think it's really neat to see if you have a ton of money and you can do the very best for what the plants want. They might have done one of these underground greenhouses in the past, but I know they have like bananas, avocados, figs, like other acai, tropical fruits in this greenhouse in Montana. I think the way they do actually make money though is agro-tourism. So they have like Airbnb rentals on their property. And if you even look at the map of Hamilton, like a Google map, it's like one of those pinpoints on there of Hamilton. It's like ABC Acres, just south of town. They also started their own school for their kids. I believe it was Riverstone School. They had started homeschooling, but then they're like, oh, let's just go ahead and start a school, like this private school, and very just earthy, natural focus at the school. We've known a couple people that have worked there over the years. But yeah, it's really interesting what they do with plants. And I think it's really cool. If you have money, why not make the very best environment you possibly can for your plants?
Who knows? Throwing a lot of money at something doesn't make a lot of sense until years and years later when we're like, oh, wow, like that was a huge advance.
Well, exactly. And then so who knows if shit hits the fan and we all have to produce our own food
Yeah.
and all of a sudden there's bananas are going to be worth so much here. You can't get a banana shipped in from Panama anymore, wherever it comes from. You have to get your local banana. So maybe they're just ahead of the curve there. Like I said, it's been really interesting watching them over the years and all the different things that they're up to. And one of the things we were really watching they were doing was hugelkulture. Have you heard of this? Okay, hugel. We always thought it was hugel, but it's hugel. Um, hugelkulture. And you bury logs and sticks and things like that under earth and mound sort of system so that wood breaks down in the soil, like provides you with a lot of organic matter, and then you can plant on top of these hugels. And there's a method of doing it. So you start with smaller plants, break down the soil, everything kind of gets mixed in. And after a couple years, like it's mixed in enough. And that was their whole goal. They wanted to plant fruit trees on these hugels. I don't know what you call it, but they did dig into the ground, had different layers, and the further down it went into the ground, these hugels, I'm talking about like a pit, they had different layers down into this pit. So the ones down low were like the most protected from cold. It was warmer down there at the bottom of this pit. And so anyway, the whole idea was you could have a whole different climate zone down there.
But that's why I'm thinking about like maybe fig, where like the yields are pretty low on a per plant basis. But most of the farms that we have in New England are kind of limited on space, where in Montana, you're not limited at all. So if you just have like huge pits that are protected and you make up for that like low yield per plant by recognizing that you can only grow as much plant tissue in 1 year and just plant a lot more plants, then maybe you could produce enough commercially in Montana with enough space.
Yeah, one thing Montana has going for it is in the summer, the super long day length. When it is the season, you have a lot more daylight hours than you'd have like in the South. If you could just like make the best of both worlds, long daylight, dig down, have like a whole different climate zone, deeper down the earth you go. Long story short, the hugelkulture didn't work out for them so well. They didn't wait long enough for all that woody material to get composted enough underground, and they planted too early these fruit trees in that process, so that after just a year or so, it ended up burning the roots of these fruit trees that they had put in because it was just so warm. It was still composting underground.
I mean, you kind of saw that coming, didn't you? That they were going to
Well,
plant
we
too
kind
early.
of we're like, wow, it's kind of early in the hugel process to be planting like deep rooted things. You're supposed to start with like really shallow rooted things and then to gradually work your way up to like deeper roots as it has composted.
I have a degree in horticulture, which, doesn't really say much. But, and they always say, like, oh, like, I'll save you the time and money it would take to get a degree in horticulture. Like, there's a handful of things that I learned that I've taken. And one is everything you see above ground is mirrored below ground. And I don't think that comes naturally to people.
Yeah, you can't see it. It's like
Right.
out of sight, out of mind.
Well, Casey and I certainly got out over our skis in terms of understanding what might have been going on below ground in this attempt at hugelkulture to grow figs in Montana. So we called in the big guns to hold us by the hand and explain what might have happened in the soil. That is Caleb Goossen. You know him, you love him. Caleb is an educator and a scientist, and you might know his name if you follow him on Instagram at Organic Crop Specialist or subscribe to his newsletter from Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. Caleb joined the call as Casey and I were having a conversation about the scientific method, and it turned into a conversation about what it's like to be a scientist in a world of non-scientists.
Well, one of the most important parts of science is having an argument, and we should probably phrase it in a different way because it's very off-putting to some people to call it that, because healthy scientific debate can be very off-putting. And it can also be very toxic and it can be not healthy. But a scientist in a silo is a bad idea. It's just bad. If you're in an echo chamber, equally bad. It's the critical aspect of the scientific method is peer review with critique, critical peer review. Sometimes it gets way too personal, or there's the emotional, psychological aspect of it. And you get scientists beefing for years. And it's very true, this old saying of science advances one death at a time. Because sometimes an old theory, an old approach, understanding is rigorously defended by somebody with a lot of power. And sometimes you just wait for that generational change. And it's similar to politics. Suddenly, boom, cannabis is decriminalized. It only took a certain amount of demographic turnover, probably.
And all of a sudden, like, this is the popular thing, or that's the popular thing, like, that's old hat. From a cultural point of view, something else I've noticed is that people who have PhDs, it's not just like they got extra training. Like, their brains either were fundamentally different or were fundamentally changed by the process of having your ass handed to you on a regular basis for years at a time and having to defend your existence, not only from the point of view of the work that you're doing, but also like there's not many other fields where you have to submit your CV so frequently. Like the number of times like you're writing a grant and saying, can I have money? Here's my proof that I'm qualified to do my job, right? Like that is a very normal part of this process too. So we are very used to defending ourselves, like defending our existence, defending our expertise, defending our arguments, to the point where your brain changes. And I've noticed a lot of the times if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't have that experience and I'm criticizing them, my first response is like, why are they reacting so negatively? Like, all I'm doing is threatening their way of life. And then they go, oh, wait, no, I'm the weirdo here, right? Like, people aren't used to having their work criticized. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I think it might make sense to think about this because I think when we talk about people who are quote unquote doing science, which like for lack of a better definition is asking questions and trying to answer it, like trying to explain the natural world versus practitioners of that information. So people who have extensive knowledge of the biological world. And that can be somebody who's a scientist or somebody who has extensive knowledge because they're out farming, they're out doing whatever. That might be a good place like to frame our conversation for today, because should we talk about hugelkulture? Should we talk about nitrogen cycling? Should we talk like, what did you think, Caleb? Where do you want to spend your time?
I can give you my quick spiel on hugelkulture. We could talk about passive solar greenhouses, which have been very much a thing for decades. When you were talking about a researcher looking into it, there's another saying that my academic advisor said a lot of, everything old is new again. He said it both tongue in cheek of like, yeah, that was looked into decades ago. Here, you should look up so-and-so because they did this. But he would then immediately also say, and maybe it's worth looking at again, because oftentimes, we have different analyses, different approaches, or circumstances have changed, right? Like oil is not cheap now, and that impacts a lot of things. The nitrogen cycling is absolutely an aspect of hugelkulture, but very much just a portion of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about nitrogen cycling in general. Because it's really just about, is it there? Is it locked up? Is it becoming available again?
Can you start at the beginning on that? Because I literally do not know what hugelkulture is. Like I read about it and I got more confused than when I started.
I don't remember the nitrogen cycle. I know I learned it in like college biology, but I'm like, what was the cycle again? That's all I need to know.
Cycle is sort of a silly word for nitrogen because it's much more like a spider web. It's not going in a cycle the way that we can easily think of like water going up into the sky, down back to Earth. Nitrogen is going into the atmosphere, out of the atmosphere, into this form, into that form, into this animal. You can't trace it in a neat path. So nitrogen is the biggest component of our atmosphere gases. We're surrounded by nitrogen, but that's diatomic nitrogen, N2 gas, and it is incredibly inert and it doesn't really react with much at all. The wonderful microbes that can take that gas and turn it into other forms drive pretty much almost all natural nitrogen cycling on Earth. Not exclusively, but there are other things that are happening. What these microbes can do in the absence of oxygen, however, they also often rely on oxygen, very confusing. They can take that atmospheric nitrogen gas and convert it into ammonium. And ammonium/ammonia, same basic compound, but depending on your pH, it's either ammonium, which can really click into your soil well, or it might be ammonia, which can easily volatilize and be a gas and get lost back to the atmosphere again. We know that smell of ammonia. When you have a really nitrogen-rich manure, like chicken manure, and it sits for a long time, it produces a lot of ammonia. You smell it usually, especially if it's been covered and trapping that ammonium.
We've said so far is like you have your N2 in the air, like the codependent couple. And there's a couple different ways that you can split up and home wreck that couple, right? And one of that is microbial. And like there's all sorts of things that can happen to microbial. There's also like man-made ways to do it, which is like it requires a lot of electricity. We're not going to talk about that today because we're just going to talk about organic practices.
I always bring it up as part of it because it makes a really good point. These microbes that can we call it fixing nitrogen. They're taking it out of the air and fixing it into a form that can remain in the soil or in water occasionally. But the most famous ones that we think of are the ones that are associated with legumes. And that is why legumes are the magic cover crops that can produce nitrogen. All cover crops are good at cycling different nutrients that are already there. Sometimes they might make it more accessible to plants, what's already in the soil, or if it's really deep taprooted, it might pull up stuff that had leached to lower levels. People say we're building fertility. You're probably building soil health and improving fertility cycling, except when you have legumes, because they have that beautiful relationship with those bacteria. They are feeding the bacteria, and they're creating a home for them in the nodules down at the roots, and the bacteria are fixing nitrogen.
You know how you were saying whatever is old is new again? I would argue that probiotics and prebiotics are just a rebranding of fiber, right? So like when we're saying, oh, there's all these benefits of taking a prebiotic and a probiotic, come to find out prebiotics are just fiber, like soluble and insoluble fiber that feed the good bacteria in your body. And those are beneficial, and we've always known that. But now we buy a bottle that says prebiotic, and it's whatever's old is new again. It's a rebranding.
And again, legumes could be your cheaper solution because if you eat your beans, you're providing all
It all
sorts of
comes
great
full circle in
prebiotics
these
and
cycles. I have
probiotics.
a question. The leguminous crops, it's my understanding that when you inoculate them with inoculum, is that the bacteria that is working together with those nodules to help fix the nitrogen? And what would happen if you don't inoculate them? Just not as many bacteria around, so not as much nitrogen fixation capacity.
If you buy the correct inoculum for your legume, then it is the bacteria that works. Different legume species, or at least broader groups of multiple species, have evolved with different types of bacteria. You may or may not have that bacteria present in your soil. In general, especially if it's a new practice or new soil to you, it's cheap insurance to buy the inoculum. There are claims that the strains of bacteria that are included are more efficient at fixing nitrogen. And I imagine that in some instances that probably matters, but broad brushstrokes, it's probably more important that you just plant a legume. So here in our Northeast context, every lawn has some white clover in it unless you're spraying to get rid of them. So you probably have plenty of the bacteria that have built up over years because they've been in association with that white clover. So if you want to plant a clover, tear up your lawn and turn it into garden, and then you want to cover crop with a clover occasionally, you've probably got plenty of that bacteria. You probably don't need to buy the inoculant. You've got a field, it's been in cow corn for years, and you're taking it over and you want to build up your soil health, do some groovy cover cropping, and you're going to do peas and oats. You should probably inoculate those peas. Otherwise, they may not have the bacteria they need. If you're gardening and you're growing peas and beans and you're intermingled with your peppers and your tomatoes because you're being really groovy and cool and you want to interplant, don't bother, because even if the bacteria aren't present, you're already supplying nitrogen to those other crops. And if there's nitrogen already present in the soil, the legume is not going to share its hard-earned sugar with those bacteria. Why would it?
What you've just done is just described some chaos that to some extent, we can't control the chaos, but what we can do is make sure that there's plenty of organic matter in that soil. If the moisture content, the temperature, these things are all things that could help us explain things that happen if you aren't getting the performance out of the soil that you expect. Of course, people have that link for legumes adding nitrogen to the soil, but just to keep in mind that organic matter writ large, like even wood contribute to the microbial life in any soil. I think part of the conversation that Casey and I were having kind of Monday morning quarterbacking what happened with these figs on a hugelkulture mound was saying that every soil is different. And so every soil is going to have a different complex of microbes that work on whatever you give it at a different rate. Could you explain what you think might have happened in that fig situation? Or could we talk about the time frame? Like, how long should a wood-based hugelkulture take to break down? And like, is it something that you can predict?
So I'm assuming the figs exhibited nitrogen deficiency symptoms.
I mean, you didn't see
Did they
these figs,
yellow up?
Casey. You just heard that they got burnt up. Do you know what that meant?
You showed me pictures of them, and they had made these hugel beds with big chunks of wood down there. Did the hugels planted those figs too soon while the wood was still decomposing, rotting, composting basically, and burned the roots?
For Anna and my jobs, usually, we are often playing detective because it can be many things at once. It could really just be one thing. And oftentimes, when we're talking with growers, they might have one idea in mind. And it many times the intuition or the experience, and they can often very commonly be right. And when we speak to each other, extension folks often consult with each other, like, what do you think about this? And we are just as biased as anybody else. We all have our like go-to, like, oh, I think it's probably X, Y, or Z. And this is kind of like why scientists need to have debate and critique, because you are trapped in your own bubble as a human animal. And what you think is going on may not be what's going on. So we're always working with the information we have. I can talk about some scenarios because we talked about nitrogen, we're talking about hugelkulture, and there was some discussion about sort of using composting as a heat source. It's all very much related. Not that this is necessarily what happened to them, but going along this thread first anyway, where it all boils down to nitrogen and carbon ratios. If you have a ton of carbon, especially if it's fresh, meaning bacteria haven't had time to work on it, there's really not much nitrogen in that system yet. So you're dumping a bunch of carbon in. Hugelkulture probably means different things to different people. There's like some of the original definitions and like where it comes from and how it gets that Danish name. But then there's also people who are making raised garden beds and they dump some logs in to help fill up the lower parts and then put in their richer soil on top. There are some big claims. They're not wrong, but it's context dependent. If you cut down a tree, cut it up into firewood like logs and dump it in, you're not going to have a spongy reservoir of both water and fertility. You're going to have wood and it's going to sit there. It's going to be really big chunks of wood. And so it will have a large volume relative to its surface area. And volume to surface area matters a lot for microbial interactions. They're teeny tiny. They work on the surface of things. They can't just get into the middle of that log and start eating the middle of it. If you have sawdust, that has a much higher surface area relative to the volume. Basically, the bigger the chunks, the fresher it is, the less bacteria have worked on it. A bacteria trying to work on it is going to have a ton of carbon available to it, and unless you're adding nitrogen, not enough nitrogen. So it's going to just very slowly nibble at the edges. You're not hot composting at all.
And now what's hot compost?
The most common definition, and especially if you're using organic regulations, you have to get the compost active enough with microbial cycling enough that it will get up to a high temperature, dependent both on the mass of the pile, because if you have a small home compost, even if you've got great composting happening, that heat will dissipate. And again, that comes to surface area to volume, because you have a smaller pile and there's just a lot more edges where the heat can kind of radiate out and you can have more air flowing through. But if you have a big pile, you get a core that gets really hot. And especially if you turn it and you get oxygen in there to get your microbes active again, and you have a good ratio of carbon to nitrogen, typically you want like 30-to-1 for composting, 30 parts carbon to each part nitrogen. You can get some really hot temperatures. You can go hotter than you might want for active composting, for quality compost. Some people go so far as to heat hot tubs that way.
Whenever I think of like a hot fertilizer, like chicken manure being too hot, it means high nitrogen in my mind. But what we're talking about here is literal temperature, right?
Yes.
Which also could be facilitated by having a lot of nitrogen in that pile, right?
Relative to the amount of carbon. So if you have a slow compost where it's just slowly rotting, most household compost, that's really what you're doing. If you do have a good sense that it's low in nitrogen, then you add nitrogen, something hot in terms of nitrogen content, then you might encourage hot composting in terms of temperature, because you'll get that good ratio the microbes need to really work and flourish. And then it's really just that respiration. We maintain our body temperature because we're metabolizing food, we're respiring, taking oxygen, taking carbon from our food, plopping them together, breathing out carbon dioxide generates heat. And if you do it enough, and you have enough of it going on next to each other, you can build up a lot of heat. So the carbon that was there in organic matter form is turning into gas. It's leaving, your pile shrinks. When you have a hugelkulture mound and you first put in fresh material that hasn't been rotting at all, then you put soil over it. That soil probably has nitrogen in it. And if you fertilized it, if it was already rich garden soil, that's probably all the plant needs. If it's very fresh wood, it's probably not breaking down and composting and getting hot. If it's aged wood, I would say if I were trying to create a hugelkulture mound and grow in it this year, and I want to get the maximum benefits, I would go into the woods, because I'm fortunate to have woods around me, and I would grab old logs that had been sitting on the ground for a while and had gotten punky. That carbon is way more accessible. Just physically, the material has way more surface area. There's holes in and out of it. Some of that carbon has already been respired away. There are free living bacteria that are fixing their own nitrogen. Basically, that log already has a more favorable carbon to nitrogen ratio. You're still probably not going to get hot composting unless you dose it with more nitrogen. If you are starting with really fresh wood, you do probably want to continue to be adding enough fertility to support whatever you're trying to grow that year. You can't count on the fertility that's there in that wood to really matter because it's mostly just carbon. The wood doesn't magically provide nutrients. As it breaks down, it can become a great sponge, a great spot for microbes to live. Also, that sponge, if you've ever stuck your hand in a log that's rotting in the woods, you know it holds moisture really well. And so if things are droughty, your plants will ideally have gotten big enough that they root right down into it and they can pull moisture from there. So depending on how the fig situation, how they created their hugelkulture mound, they may have provided enough nitrogen to get some hot composting going on. The issue of burnt roots could be heat, but unless it was a really big pile that got really hot, it probably wasn't. They probably didn't get temperatures hot enough. Figs like it warm. We're often talking about figs in terms of what can we get away with. I grow figs and I bury them for the winter, right? Like I keel the whole plant over and bury it because it can't take the cold. It wants a nice hot summer. It would love to have warm roots. The other thing that happens when things are breaking down, you may have a lot of big organic compounds like proteins in the manure. And those, as bacteria work on them, the first thing they release are ammonia type molecules. And that can turn into ammonia gas. And you can get ammonia burn on roots. That would burn roots. You can also get ammonia toxicity symptoms, especially on lower leaves, where the ammonia gas is coming out of the soil. And if there's not a good breeze, if it's in a high tunnel or something, and the sides are down, you can get it building up to concerning levels for the plant. The other thing that things breaking down and composting can do is they can release volatile organic acids, and those can be toxic as well.
We were really interested in doing hugelkulture when we were first starting out gardening because we didn't have hardly any organic matter in our soil. And we're like, wow, this is a great thing. And especially for us, we have a lot of cottonwood trees around that naturally just fall and branches fall. And we have just this wood we had to dispose of anyway. And we had been doing burn piles and we're like, wouldn't it be so much more, sustainable to not burn this and actually bury it and make it part of our garden? And before we did this, we're like, oh, these farmers right up the road are doing it. Let's see how it works for them. I don't know exactly the process they did for exactly how they built their hugel, so I can't speak to that, but I still really am interested in doing it. And I do like to learn from other people's mistakes more than me making the mistake. And I try and keep an open mind. Was it burning of these roots that happened in the hugels, or was it actually the gaps between all the wood and when it might have squished the roots? When the wood decomposed, when these hugels were then just like compacting, things were moving around in the soil more than those roots were ready to be able to handle.
I've got another theory that I think is more likely. When you make a hugel mound, you're raising your soil up, and that's great. Like raised beds are really great for improving drainage because it gives the water somewhere to go down to relative to the surrounding soil. Especially when you have a freshly made hugelkulture mound, people will often take big branches and springy branches. You will often find essentially a soil level that is tented up, and there are big air gaps down below. The roots don't like to grow through air, and they need enough moisture. But if they can make it down there, roots are also wood. They're going to not be squished. The bigger issue probably is that there's a really good chance that it
Just the
dried
air
out.
pockets in the soil.
Well, to maintain a brand new hugelkulture mound that's built with fresh, springy wood, you need to keep water on it constantly, just about, because you need to water it like every day. Then the next year, don't try to manage it the same way because guess what? Now it's compacted, your plants have access to that wood, and you might just create a soggy mess and lose your fertility as you water too much. It really is tricky. You can't treat it like actual soil. Your ideal situation is that you find that you have a hugel mound that somebody built you 10 years ago. But if you're starting one, just don't put your most precious plants into it because it's going to be a tricky thing. It's a long-term plan. It's not a short-term plan. Personally, I built one because I wanted to like play around with it. It can be great. I've also had some failures, especially earlier on. I fertilized the heck out of it because I was like, I don't want it all locked up. I also just keep adding wood chips to the top because it keeps shrinking down.
Okay, yeah. Like, of course, the conclusion is it's complicated. And we can't really say what happened in this particular fig instance. We have some theories about what happened. I'm going to say it probably wasn't heat from what you described. Maybe it was nitrogen robbing. Probably not, because we don't think it was that hot. It may have been that it just dried out because the wood was new, and or the roots were just air pruned because they found their way to air pockets in there. So like those are some things that could happen. Maybe a good way to dismount this conversation would be that question that Casey had, which was, we have all this wood on the property. Would that new person, not knowing anything about their soil, right, or maybe having a little bit of history about what might be going, like the microbes that are partying in their soil, would they be better grinding that up into sawdust and composting it and then applying it to their field, or finding a way to like quote unquote save some time and put it in the field? Do you have any advice for someone who's like trying to save themselves some time by throwing that new wood into their plots?
To build a hugelkulture specifically, yeah, the older the wood, the more surface area, smaller particles, the better probably. You do get smaller springy branches are just a physical issue in that first year in particular. Best practices are what can you get your hands on cheap and easy that's nearby, right?
Our situation is just like we have all this cottonwood, which I feel like would be an amazing, perfect wood for a hugel. Cottonwood, relatively inert as far as like chemical output, but also spongy, punky, like lots of air gaps in there for it's already naturally kind of decomposed even when it's fresh.
I think you want to get like groovy, permaculture-y, like let's stack some functions, cut down a cottonwood, inoculate it with oyster mushroom, grow some oyster mushrooms. And when it's not fruiting very good anymore and it's getting really spongy, make it into a hugelkulture bed. Because then you've already got the wood has been worked on. It's going to be spongy. Of course, do whatever you want, right? Like if you've got some dead branches, dead logs lying around, go for it. Just know that like the closer it is to being pure carbon, the harder it is to get that end result that you want. It will get there over time, might take longer. You can also do that with cover crops, right? Our soils and the stuff in our soils are bank accounts. You can make deposits and you can make withdrawals, and the cycling is how that works.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. A lot to digest. But this is a topic I promise we will return to because there's so many ways that folks are making these techniques work for them in brilliant ways, taking advantage of what they have around them for crop nutrients, for heat, for all sorts of things. So watch this space. Serious Grower Podcast is a production of New Hampshire community-supported research. If you are interested in becoming a co-host or would like to learn more about our mission to democratize agricultural research, visit our website at nhcsr.org. Make sure to check out our YouTube channel at NHCSR. We're sharing insights from the agricultural research community and vlogging about our research efforts on the farm. You can support this work by liking and subscribing, and even better, consider joining our Patreon community.